I was asked to speak about, well, classical music in the marketplace. That was the entire brief. I thought because most of us hear classical music, but perceive only the exterior of the world that the classical music industry presents, which is one of polish, of prestige, I just wanted to try and give you the benefit of my personal experience as someone who's worked in the management of classical music and also a historian of the subject, to just try and give you a historical and contemporary perspective of how the market works in interaction with this rather elusive art form. It's been a rather troubled and complex relationship over the last 4 centuries. I want to begin with 2 quotes. Here's Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, 25 years old, newly arrived in Vienna in April 1781, writing to his father Leopold back in Salzburg. He says, "I can assure you this is a magnificent place, and for my calling, the best place in the world. Anyone will tell you that. I like it here. I'm taking full advantage of everything as best I can. Believe me, it's my full intention to make as much money as I can. For after your health, money is the best thing you can have in life." Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Second was just a question that was asked to me by a musicology academic who was researching the practice and sociology, essentially, of symphony orchestras in the Western world. And he said to me, so when an overseas orchestra tours Europe, what do they do with all the profits? And no response there. Any one of my colleagues, a junior intern in an orchestral management office, would have laughed out loud at that suggestion. There are no or very, very little profits in classical music, certainly in the performance side of classical music. I'll come back to Mozart in a moment. First thing to say, and there's one thing to take away from this, it's this one fact, it's that classical music in its most developed forms, Western classical music, in its most developed forms, symphonies, orchestras and operas, producing it is expensive. The orchestra I worked for 16 years, the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra in the United Kingdom, has 82 musicians on permanent contract, supported by around 42 permanent staff. The Royal Opera House at Covent Garden in the United Kingdom, it's a major national opera company, by no means the largest in Europe. Next month it's reviving an old production of Puccini's Tosca. It's a fairly standard late season revival. And just looking at what that requires in terms of personnel, we're talking about 7 principal singers playing with solo roles, a chorus of 46, 92 musicians in the orchestra, and around 63 stage and production crew, all payrolled or contracted freelance staff. So their support, that's an irreducible minimum of 208 performers, simply to get the show on stage. They're supported in addition by around 89 permanent management and venue staff, and that doesn't take into account the cost of running the venue, building sets, developing productions, the huge ancillary amounts of sort of freelance work that has to be done to support that. And these are highly qualified people. A professional musician is a postgraduate. Typically 7 to 10 years of study are required to achieve a professional level in this art form. They're performing at a level of physical ability comparable to elite athletes, and they're just as vulnerable to physical risk. And so as with any highly skilled professionals, musicians are expensive. Salaries are expensive. These large groups of highly skilled professionals you need to put together to perform classical music at all are highly expensive. So you sell tickets, but there's a problem there as well. The absolute capacity per performance at the Royal Opera House in London, again, a largish opera house, is 2,200 seats. And this is an art form that cannot be performed amplified. There's a limit to the size of venues, to the size of audiences it can realistically be performed to. It really can't get much bigger. So you have a very sizable outlay and a very limited scope for income. The result of this is that since the 17th century at least, large-scale classical music has consistently been unable to survive long-term in an unrestricted marketplace. There are certain irreducible costs that are intrinsic to the art form, costs which are not today, and for the most part never have been, recoverable from ticket sales. In fact, thinking today about the world's major performing groups, I can't think of a single major orchestra or opera company performing serious classical music in the world today which functions without subsidy. So what this means is that where there has been large-scale classical music open to a general audience, historically there's almost always been subsidy in some form, either state funding or private or corporate philanthropy. Looking back at the 17th to 18th century, typically you have a range of state and aristocratic sources of patronage. the church, noblemen, princes. Monteverdi composed his opera Orfeo in 1607 for the Gonzaga dukes in Mantua, their lavish court. Joseph Haydn, to take one example, in the late 18th century, spent much of his working life at the court of Prince Paul the Magnificent, Esterhazy, a Hungarian nobleman whose estate was known as the Versailles of Hungary, and included not only a full-time permanent orchestra of around 25 players, but an opera house and a marionette theatre simply on his estate. That was viable in that era and with that kind of wealth. But even where there was an emerging mercantile middle class, such as in London in the early 18th century, in the 1720s, for instance, where George Friedrich Handel made repeated attempts to make money out of opera, it could be staged really only with aristocratic patronage on a sort of subscription model, kind of forerunner of modern crowdfunding. There were frequent collapses, frequent bankruptcies, frequent financial failures, with no copyright system in place until the early 20th century. This left composers with, well, very vulnerable, certainly very, very exposed to the market. Mozart, who we heard from earlier, is an interesting case. He attempted in the 1780s to surf the rise of a mercantile and cultured middle class in Vienna, rather to the horror of his father, who was a lifelong salaried court musician. And he did it with mixed success. There were booms, there were busts. I mean, it's often said that Mozart died in poverty. It doesn't seem, from looking at his finances, that is strictly true. He had an economical burial when he finally died, but he had large outlays and he had a fluctuating income. His cash flow was not very good. But I mean, looking towards the end of his life, in the final year of his life, 1791, he wrote two major operas. La Clemenza de Tito was a state commission, commissioned by the Austrian emperor to commemorate, as a sort of public statement, to commemorate the coronation in Prague. At the same time, Mozart was working on a far more popular work, far more accessible work, essentially a pantomime full of amusing characters, farcical situations, scenic effects, hummable tunes that's performed in a suburban theatre in Vienna with the sole purpose of making a profit. That was the Magic Flute. And it's interesting to note which of those two works has been the more enduringly popular. Perhaps this is a telling comment on the effect of state subsidies on the creative process. The demands of public funders, whether it's a monarch in the 18th century insisting on the glorification of autocracy, or a National Arts Council in the 21st century demanding that due respect be paid to climate change or multiculturalism, unfortunately, it rarely tends to produce art that audiences wish to see, or wish to pay to see, which has enduring vitality. Nonetheless, the basic problem remains. The 19th century in classical music, again, was one of boom and bust, attempting to serve the market with varying degrees of failure. Hector Berlioz, the French composer, barely escaped the debtor's prison when he was involved in attempting to promote an opera season in London in the 1850s. The costs of financial failure can be very real. Verdi in Italy had both epic successes and ruinous flops with his operas, and even Richard Wagner had to cater to the market, that most individualistic of artists. When in Paris, he had to rewrite his opera Tannhäuser specifically for the perceived needs of that public, introducing a ballet scene, which he had not previously wanted anything to do with at all. Meanwhile, to pursue his own actual long-term artistic ambitions, his dream, if you like, to sort of pursue the life of an independent romantic artist, he had to resort to patronage. The royal patronage, famously King Ludwig of Bavaria, but also, again, another sort of type of early crowdfunding, international Wagner societies, collections of his fans from around the world who basically subscribed to help him put on his operas in Bayreuth. Even then, his finances were extremely shaky. When he built his own purpose-built festival theatre in Bayreuth in Germany in the 1870s, it was a temporary structure with a wooden frame. It was not meant to last more than a couple of decades. That theatre is still there today. It's in a constant source of maintenance problems. In fact, 30 million euros of repairs were spent on it in the last decade alone, just trying to keep this thing upright. That, of course, met by the German state. So, where are we now? A very simple overview of a very complex situation. First of all, tech seems to have very limited effect, a very limited usefulness on classical music. unfortunately. Recordings are typically made for a flat fee. There was an LP boom in the 1960s, a CD boom in the 1990s, both of which pumped money into the sector. Since that point, market saturation by digital technology has stripped virtually all significant value from recorded classical music. A commercial classical, the margins are minuscule, a commercial classical recording will typically sell 1,000 to 2,000 copies globally. So recording is a prestige or legacy project for multinational corporations, or typically a boutique product created for love on the very tightest of margins by small labels, simply because they care about the repertoire, about the artists, about the art form. Again, I can't think of a single major performing company today that relies significantly on income from recordings. Looking beyond that to sort of the performance sector, again, a very, very simplified, almost caricature of the situation, but this is what we have time for. In Europe, traditionally, there is a history, mainland Europe, there's traditionally a history of substantial state subsidy for various historical and political reasons, federalism, nation building, notions of national exceptionalism. And this means that, for instance, in Germany, there are well over 80 functioning state-funded opera houses, 70 or more state-funded symphony orchestras at present. In France, the government subsidises IRCAM, an avant-garde contemporary music laboratory, which was for many years headed up by Pierre Boulez, a composer who achieved a status in French culture almost of equivalent to that of a sort of commissar of taste, and actually went out of his way to suppress rivals who wrote music in a different style. Again, we see the effect here of one particular stream of subsidy on the creativity. Now, this European model, of course, is much liked and admired by musicians. It makes for manageable workloads, pensions, comfortable salaries, high social standing. The downside, I think, can be described as an element of moral risk. Creative artists, composers, opera directors no longer face the consequence of failure, if you like, artistic failure. If what they write does not connect with an audience, they get paid substantially nonetheless. Their esteem remains unchallenged. There is very little real consequence. I would argue that leads to less interesting art than would otherwise be the case. The polar opposite, as so often in these discussions, is the United States of America. Historically, very limited levels of state funding for classical music, but substantial levels of private philanthropy. The Metropolitan Opera in New York was said in 2023 to have an endowment of around $255 million. The Boston Symphony Orchestra, I think the longest established of the major American orchestras, has an endowment of around $456 million. Again, these are not astronomical sums, but certainly in the world of the arts, very, very substantial. Again, here there are benefits, there are disadvantages. The main argument against the American system is that it leads to an anxiety about pleasing the audience above taking artistic risk, but particularly the audience that donates the money. Conservative productions, such as those seen at the New York Metropolitan Opera, a lack of ambition perhaps in programming, and perhaps an alienation of younger generations who are less able to respond to that kind of work. There's been some rather alarming instances of the Metropolitan Opera drawing down on the capital of its endowments over the last decade, and the situation does not look as strong as it once did. Meanwhile, there's a large network of regional orchestras and companies of the United States which exist on an absolute shoestring. My own country, the UK, I might once have said it was a happy medium. I'm starting to wonder if that's the case. Typically, 1/3 of the income for a major arts classical music organisation is subsidy, state subsidy. 1/3 would be philanthropy. 1/3 is audience income, which gives enough stability to take artistic risks, but also exposes the organisation to the market to an extent. There is some flexibility, there is some responsiveness, there is some need to produce work that will have a broad appeal. Then there's also a limited private sector. Country house opera companies do successfully raise funds from ticket sales, but also from donors. Very few of them have state funding. But that in itself, as they themselves are the first to admit, is dependent on this infrastructure, subsidised infrastructure that provides for the training and availability of professional musicians. So, in conclusion, we seem to be stuck on the horns of a dilemma. State funding, whether wielded as a bludgeon or as a security blanket, leads to disappointing and moribund art. Total exposure to the market leads to no art of this sort. Subsidy remains vital. So too does the discipline and vitality created by engagement with a paying public, with a mind of its own. Throughout musical history, there have been examples of the most vital, the most exciting moments, most creative moments coming when the market has been involved. Purcell's theatre music, Corelli's concertos, Mozart's comic operas, Handel's oratorios, Haydn's London symphonies, Gershwin's and Bernstein's musicals. It's recently been its most vital, creative and popular when setting out to make as much money as it can, as Mozart put it. But if we believe that classical music is one of the great joys of life, one of the great glories and rewards of Western civilization, we need to realise it does have to be nurtured and fed by both the state and the private individual, and we need to make policy accordingly. The balance is complex. It will not thrive unaided. Do we want classical music or not? If not, fine. I would be sad. Many people go through life very happily without it. If we do think it's valuable, we need to pay for it somehow. Culture this advanced, by definition, has to be cultivated, and someone has to provide the sunlight and water. Thank you.
I can see that the overall picture is depressing in a certain sense if you're out of a market perspective. Are there any individual examples of orchestras, soloists, smaller ensembles that manage to find new ways of financing?
Well, I mean, the smaller you go with an ensemble, the easier, of course, it gets to fund it. If it's just one person, a soloist, a performer, operating it autonomously, they do have all sorts of opportunities. They can make their own working conditions, their own terms. I mean, this is why I'm specifically concentrating on the largest, the most complex manifestations, the symphony orchestra, the opera house. I think these are the most fragile, the most exposed. But certainly I can think of chamber music collectives as well, and private enterprises across Europe, small-scale festivals. If it's done on a small scale, and the artists are willing to sort of accept compromises, financial compromises, to make it work, it is viable. And again, there are many boutique record labels as well who do it solely for the love of the art form, with no serious hope of a return on margins. I mean, famously, the founder of Hyperion Records, a major independent label of the United Kingdom, supplemented his recording budget by operating an ice cream van for several years. He also worked briefly as a taxi driver.
Okay. Are there examples of crowdfunding?
Yes, more and more so. I mean, I say it goes back quite a long way. The idea of subscriptions, which was common in the era before royalties and copyright made publication viable, a composer would typically circulate a subscription list to his supporters, aristocrats, patrons, anyone who's interested, and would basically fund the thing in advance and make sure there was an income before the music was sent out into the world. Haydn did that, Mozart did that, Beethoven did it sometimes, and then Richard Wagner did it on a grand scale in the 19th century, as he did everything on a grand scale. And today's orchestras more and more are very, very mindful of this. I was involved in the crowdfunding project for a cycle of recordings of symphonies by the Austrian composer Hans Gall a few years ago. It was done through a standard fundraising platform. The conductor and the orchestra got together, put together a campaign, and managed to get the funds needed to get these recordings, which will never make a profit, but nonetheless make them exist, make the music audible, get the music out there, which is what they were most concerned about.
Okay, thank you very much.